Hello, and welcome to Grand Dukes of the West, Episode 42, Joan of Arc, Part 3, The Martyr. In our last episode, Joan of Arc led Dauphin Charles to Reims. As the Maid stood by, holding her battle standard aloft, the prince was anointed with holy oil and proclaimed King Charles VII. This moment was the peak of her career. Joan was recognized as the driving force behind this event, and in shepherding the Dauphin to his coronation, she had completed her God-given mission. But if Reims was the peak of her career, everything that followed was decline. After the king had been crowned, the advance that Joan had begun slowed and finally stalled before the walls of Paris. Once the royal army withdrew from Paris, the king's strategy changed. He had always been temperamentally disinclined to pursue the aggressive strategy championed by the Maid, and now that more members of his court were urging him to take a more diplomacy-focused approach, the king fell back on his cautious ways. Now I feel like I should note that this diplomacy-focused approach was not entirely peaceful, and still included numerous campaigns against the English. But the specific targets of those campaigns were not the same ones that Joan argued for, and, most notably, the Duke of Burgundy would be wooed rather than conquered. The overriding goal of many members of the Dauphin's court was to end the long civil war between the Armagnacs and Burgundians, and unite the factions behind Charles and against the English. The most notable advocate of this return to form was Georges de la Tremoille. La Tremoille had been Charles's most influential advisor for the past few years, and his rise to power was marked by a bitter conflict with Arthur de Richemont, the Constable of France. So when Joan accepted Arthur's aid before the Battle of Patay and then petitioned Charles to forgive his constable, she ended up making an enemy of La Tremoille. But Richemont was not the only thing separating Georges and Joan. La Tremoille sincerely believed that the only way that victory could be achieved was by coming to terms with the Duke of Burgundy. And while Joan would have welcomed the submission of the Burgundians, she did believe that if they would not come over willingly, they could still be forced back into submission. Joan advocated attacks on Burgundian-held towns and territories, while La Tremoille advocated ceasefire and negotiation. Joan was no stranger to resistance at court, but over the past year she had routinely gotten her way. Her results spoke for themselves, and her sanctimonious charisma allowed her to overcome her political rivals. However, now things were different, as her defeat before the walls of Paris ended her run of successes, and opened the door to those who thought she had run her course. When Joan first came to court, her claims were that she would relieve the siege of Orléans and lead the Dauphin to Reims to be crowned. Now, in the autumn of 1429, Joan had accomplished her God-given mission, but that also meant that, from a certain point of view, she had served her purpose. The Maid now insisted that her mission included driving the English out of France entirely, but those around the king, and at this point the king himself, were keen to push her out of the limelight. Orléans had been relieved, the central Loire had been cleared of the English, and Charles had been crowned. Perhaps most importantly, scores of French soldiers were now flocking to the king's banner, and the English were demoralized. But while Joan the symbol had been a huge boon to Charles's cause, Joan the person was becoming a liability. The Maid's march through Burgundian territory on the way to Reims, her aggressive conduct against the Duke, and her attack on Paris meant that she was now another thing standing in the way of reconciliation. Moreover, her conduct at the siege of Paris bordered on outright insubordination, and it was becoming clear to the court that Joan was becoming harder to rein in. And now, even Joan the symbol was a bit of a liability too. In the first stage of her career, her successes were seen as proof that she was sent by God. But once she faced setback, doubts began to emerge. And if Joan was not really sent by God, then the king had entrusted his fate to a heretical peasant girl. Not only was doubt now shed on her sanctity, but it was also now shed on her aggressive tactics. When success was guaranteed, the French commanders were more willing to spend their soldiers on frontal attacks against entrenched positions. But if their soldiers were to die in vain, they preferred a bit more caution. But for all of the opposition that Joan was facing at court, she was still a potent symbol, and still loved by the troops. She could not be easily dismissed without risking a serious blow to morale, so instead, she was sidelined. The Maid had been injured at Paris, and while she still wanted to fight on, she did need some time to rest and recover. After a month away from action, the king put Joan in the care of Charles d'Albret, the son of the Constable of France of the same name, a half-brother of Georges de la Tremoille, and the king's lieutenant in the Duchy of Berry. Once in Berry, Joan and Albret set their sights on the town of La Charite, on the border of Berry and Nevers. The town was technically in Nevers, and would have been protected by a truce with the Duke of Burgundy, except for the fact that La Charite was held by an independent commander rather than a Burgundian. This commander, Pierre Grissart, was nominally a Burgundian ally, but in practice he answered to no one. Grissart had gained control of La Charite in late 1423, when he seized it from a Dauphinist force which had taken the town the previous year. And since then he had turned the town and its surrounding area into his own personal lordship. Grissart often coordinated his efforts with Philip's ducal council in Dijon. He received a pension from both the English and Burgundians, and he directed most of his raiding into Berry. But he was still out for himself, and occasionally made himself a nuisance to the Duke of Burgundy. More worrying for the Duke was the fact that over the past year or so, Grissart had begun to show a preference to the English over Burgundy, and began expanding his holdings in Nevers. If the Duke were to break from the English, Grissart could pose as much of a threat to Burgundy as he did to Berry. While Philip the Good undoubtedly preferred La Charite to remain in Grissart's hands rather than Charles's, he was not going to repudiate the recent truce to protect the mercenary captain. So, Joan was sent to La Charite for a few reasons. First, as I just said, while it was on the border of French France and Burgundian France, it was not covered by the truce between Charles and Philip, and so it could be attacked with minimal offense to the Duke of Burgundy. Second, as it was on a strategic point of the border, taking La Charite would protect Berry from raids, and open up Nevers to them if the truce expired and was not renewed. And third, from a personal point of view, La Tremoille had been captured and ransomed by Pierre Grissart 2 years previously, despite being under the protection of an order of safe conduct, and he wanted revenge. Not only was La Charite worth taking, but it was also far enough from the main action of the 100 Years' War that Joan could be effectively sidelined with her assignment there. So Georges de la Tremoille must have patted himself on the back when he arranged to get the Maid out of the way by having her deal with an old enemy of his. The campaign started off well enough with the capture of the town of Saint-Pierre-le-Moutier, which marked Grissart's southernmost holding along the Loire. Saint-Pierre was more village than city, and while it had walls and a moat, it was sparsely populated and sparsely defended. However, Joan and Albret's force was also quite small, and while a siege was attempted, it was unlikely to end in victory. After a few days of siege, Joan took the town using her favorite strategy, the frontal attack. Bundles of sticks were gathered to bridge the moat, and the French soldiers were able to scale the walls of the town with the encouragement of the Maid. While Saint-Pierre was a victory, the siege and storming of the town cost the army precious resources that the Court of Charles VII seemed disinclined to replace. So as Joan of Arc and Charles d'Albret marched from Saint-Pierre to La Charite, they both sent out several letters to nearby towns asking for supplies. In a letter to the town of Riom, the Maid writes, quote, "Because of the great quantities of gunpowder, arrows, and other equipment of war that were expended before the said town, and because the lords who are in this town and I are so poorly provisioned to besiege La Charite, where we are going presently, I beseech you that, as you love the welfare and honor of the king, and also those others here, that you would instantly send help for this siege, of gunpowder, saltpeter, sulfur, arrows, heavy crossbows, and other equipment of war. In this letter, and others like it, we can see that the siege of La Charite would be an extremely difficult affair. And even though Joan and Albret would be reinforced soon after reaching the town, those reinforcements did not come with more supplies. La Charite was an imposing fortress town, and as Gressart had made it his capital, he made sure that its garrison was strong and well supplied, much more so than their besiegers. After a month-long siege in the winter of 1429, the French army ran out of their limited supplies and made the decision to withdraw. The failure of the siege honestly has more to do with lack of support from the king and his council than any fault of Joan's. And by now, Joan was aware enough of the goings-on at court to place the blame squarely on Georges de la Tremoille. But the Maid's reputation was still further tarnished by her failure at La Charite. The defeat at La Charite gave La Tremoille and the court the excuse to further sideline the Maid, and for the next few months, Joan of Arc had nothing to do. Charles VII attempted to pacify her by ennobling her and her family, but Joan would have preferred a military tent to her newfound noble status. Fed up with inaction, at one point Joan of Arc wrote a letter to the Hussites in Bohemia, threatening to lead a crusade against them. But while she may have had thoughts of leaving France, she still desired to rid the kingdom of the English above all else. After a few months, the Maid would return to action, but before we get there, we need to explore the push and pull relationship between Burgundy, France, and England in late 1429 and early 1430. A few weeks after the army of Charles VII left Paris, Philip the Good made his way back to the capital. The leader of the Armagnacs had been seen off, and now the leader of the Burgundians was welcomed with great fanfare. Philip's entry into Paris marked a break with his strategy of the past few years. Well, for most of the 1420s, the Duke of Burgundy had been doing his best to extricate himself from the 100 Years' War. Now the Duke agreed to take on a more active role. Philip was made Henry VI's royal lieutenant in France, and put in charge of Paris, the Ile-de-France, and Champagne, while Bedford and the English focused their efforts on Normandy and the rest of the conquered territories. Now this was a temporary measure, and the plan was for the Duke of Burgundy to only hold this responsibility until a new English army could arrive in France. But it still showed that Philip was reevaluating his prior strategy of indifference. However, we shouldn't put too much stock in this change of strategy, as the time which the Duke of Burgundy was expected to be responsible for these lands nicely lined up with his truce with Charles VII. Philip had agreed to take on the role of basic administration and defense, but he was not expecting to fight a war for the English. The Duke of Burgundy was still indecisive about how much he wanted to commit to the war. He had some advisors arguing that he should make peace with the Dauphin, and he had others arguing for him to expand his alliance with England. First, he accepts more responsibility in Lancastrian France, then he expands his truce with Charles VII. He agrees to a new peace conference with the French king, then he postpones the conference. He agrees to summon an army to aid the English, but the army never materializes. While Philip's actions in these months appear inconsistent, and to be fair, they were, that was not the whole story. Although the Duke kept going back and forth between John of Bedford and Charles VII, he was consistently trying to get the best deal for Burgundy. It was more or less the same strategy that the Duke had been pursuing for years. When it came to the 100 Years' War, Philip was consistently inconsistent. It's just that now the situation in France was really beginning to change. But finally, in early 1430, Cardinal Henry Beaufort got Philip the Good to agree to aid the English in concrete terms, and this aid actually ended up materializing. The Duke of Burgundy agreed to summon an army of 3,000 soldiers to serve in France. He would pay 1 month's wages, while the English would pay 2. And then, after the first 3 months, the Duke would maintain a reduced force of 1,200 to be paid for by the English. In exchange for this, Philip the Good would be made the Count of Champagne and Brie. Now, this was simultaneously a huge grant, and not that much. Champagne and Brie were wealthy territories which would connect Philip's Low Country domains to the two Burgundies, and give his lands some more coherence. The Dukes of Burgundy had been major power brokers in the region for generations now, but the outright granting of Champagne and Brie would greatly increase their wealth, power, and influence. But, and this is a big but, most of Champagne and Brie now acknowledged Charles VII to be the King of France rather than Henry VI. So this grant was more theoretical than actual. It would be up to Philip to do the work to actually gain Champagne and Brie. So while this grant was a big concession in theory at least, it would further tie Philip the Good to the Lancastrian administration and further entice him to participate in the war. And it was not only promises from the English that convinced the Duke of Burgundy to take on a more active role in the war. It was also broken promises from the French. The truce made between Philip the Good and Charles VII in the autumn of 1429 included a promise to return to the Duke of Burgundy a number of towns in Champagne and southern Picardy which had thrown out their Burgundian garrisons and officers as Charles and Joan marched to Rheims and then to Paris. However, in practice, few of these towns changed hands. Some of the towns Charles denied promising. Some of them he said he would hand over eventually, but kept delaying. And some of them he had begun to hand over, but ran into issues along the way. The city of Compiegne fell into the last category. Charles VII acknowledged that the city should be handed over to the Duke, but the people of Compiegne were worried about Burgundian retribution for ceding their town to Charles in the first place, and refused to readmit a Burgundian garrison and government. Therefore, when the truce between Charles and Philip expired, the Duke of Burgundy set his sights on Compiegne. John of Luxembourg arrived in the Oise Valley in late April 1430 with the vanguard of the Burgundian army, and Philip the Good joined him there in early May. The Duke and his general began to besiege and take other forts, towns, and bridges in the region over the next few weeks, as they prepared to begin the siege of Compiegne. Meanwhile, Joan of Arc had finally decided that enough was enough, and she would return to the field with or without her king's permission. The Maid left the Loire as the truce between Charles and Burgundy was about to expire, and headed for the Ile-de-France. She took part in a siege of the citadel of Melun after the town defected to the French, and took part in a battle outside the town of Lagny-sur-Marne. While both the siege of the citadel and the Battle of Lagny were relatively minor affairs, their success bolstered Joan's confidence and reinvigorated her legend. Joan left the Loire with only a handful of companions, but over the month and a half or so that she spent in the Ile-de-France, she managed to gather a company of around 1,000 soldiers. It was not an army exactly, but it was a respectable force, and it goes to show that there were still many in France willing to fight alongside the Maid, even if the court refused to sanction her conduct. Joan of Arc was by now an independent commander, more like La Hire or Poton than the living battle standard which the court of Charles VII wanted her to be. The Maid was still in Lagny when she heard that the Duke of Burgundy was preparing to besiege Compiegne. And, possibly thinking back to her exploits at Orleans, Joan decided that she needed to aid in the defense of Compiegne. Joan of Arc arrived in the city on May the 14th, just as John of Luxembourg and Philip the Good were finishing up their other operations in the Oise Valley, and a few days later, Burgundian companies began to arrive before the walls. Compiegne was a well-defended town, and its inhabitants had been preparing for a siege. The walls were tall and thick, and the city was guarded by the river Oise on one side and a moat on the other. The people of Compiegne had been stocking up on food and military supplies ever since they first refused to return to the Duke of Burgundy. And while the French garrison in the town was not especially strong, it was strengthened by Joan of Arc and her company. But the Burgundian army at Compiegne was strong, and the Duke had brought with him many bombards and other guns, along with 17,000 pounds of gunpowder. The actual siege of Compiegne began slowly and in a piecemeal fashion, as part of the Burgundian army began to surround the city, while the rest was still focused on taking nearby forts and towns. One of the targets of the Burgundians was the nearby town of Choisy-au-Bac. Joan led 2 expeditions from Compiegne to try and relieve Choisy, and while both battles had begun in her favor, in the end, Joan and her company were repulsed both times. After the second attempt to relieve Choisy failed, the garrison surrendered to the Burgundians, and Joan of Arc began planning her next steps. By now, more Burgundian soldiers were arriving at Compiegne, and so the Maid decided that she should lead a force to swing around and hit them from the rear. The first step was finding a place to cross the Aisne River, and the nearest friendly crossing was the town of Soissons. However, while Soissons had declared for Charles VII the previous year, the town had no desire to provoke the wrath of the Duke of Burgundy by aiding in an attack on his forces. And so, while Joan and the other commanders were allowed into the town, her army was refused entry. Unable to cross, the army decamped, and not long after Joan and her army left Soissons, the town defected back to the Duke of Burgundy. The decision was made to return to Compiegne, and while Joan had been away from the city, the siege had really begun, and the Burgundian forces surrounding the city had been strengthened further. Therefore, Joan gave up on her plan to attack the Burgundians from the rear, and instead slipped back into Compiegne from a weak point in the lines in the middle of the night. The next day, the Maid took part in a sortie. Things began well for Joan and the defenders of Compiegne, but as the fighting went on, the noise alerted other Burgundian soldiers. John of Luxembourg gathered a company of men and headed towards the fighting, where he was able to turn the tide, and before long, the defenders of Compiegne began to retreat back to the town. Joan was urged to go on ahead, but she declined and preferred to cover the retreat of her soldiers. By the time that she turned and headed for the town, it was too late. The Burgundians were too close, and to leave the gates of Compiegne open any longer would have risked allowing them into the walls. The gates were closed, and Joan was trapped between the walls of Compiegne and the Burgundian army. The Maid surrendered and became the prisoner of John of Luxembourg. Philip the Good soon learned of her capture, and he hurried to meet with her. The chronicler Enguerrand de Monstrelet was actually present at this meeting, but unfortunately for us, he claimed not to remember what went down. The capture of the Maid was a sensation. The English and Burgundians were keen to spread the message far and wide, and cited it as proof that Joan of Arc was sent by the devil rather than by God. The court of Charles VII was in a more precarious position. They had clashed with Joan, but they also had to push back on the English claims. Joan of Arc had led the French to many great victories, and even now, in captivity, many still looked up to her. To fully reject the Maid would hurt the legitimacy of her victories, and Charles's own coronation. But to fully stand behind her might suggest that God had now turned his back on their cause. Therefore, the court reframed her capture as her fault, and her fault alone. Renaud de Chartres, the Archbishop of Reims and Charles's chancellor, circulated a letter where he wrote, quote, "She did not wish to pay attention to any counsel and did everything at her own pleasure. She had become full of pride due to the rich garments she had begun to wear. She had not been doing what God had commanded her, but her own will." From Compiegne, Joan was moved to John of Luxembourg's castle of Beaulieu, where a few weeks later she attempted to escape, only to be stopped by a porter who blocked her path. After a short stay at Beaulieu, she was moved again to another of John's castles, Beaurevoir, where she would remain for the next few months. While Joan was in the custody of John of Luxembourg, she was looked after by his aunt, wife, and stepdaughter, all coincidentally also named Joan, as John returned to Compiegne. In the days after the capture of the Maid, the defenders of Compiegne dug in and limited their offensive operations. On the other side, John of Luxembourg and Philip the Good made little progress, and as weeks turned to months, the siege continued and was sapping the resources of Burgundy. Meanwhile, Philip's lands in the south were under threat as attacks were launched into the counties of Burgundy and Charolais and into Mâcon. And in the north, the Prince-Bishopric of Liège began making trouble for Philip's newly acquired county of Namur. So the Duke of Burgundy sat with his army outside the walls of Compiegne as his military resources were being drained and his lands were under attack. The terms of his initial deal with the English were about to expire, and many of his soldiers expected to be dismissed soon. In these circumstances, he managed to renegotiate his arrangement with the English, and got them to agree to pay an additional subsidy for the Duke to maintain the siege of Compiegne. But new tensions then arose between the allies, as these payments were often late. The Duke of Burgundy left the siege in the care of John of Luxembourg when he learned that his cousin, Philip of Saint-Pol, the Duke of Brabant, died in August of 1430. Regardless of his responsibilities to the English, Philip the Good was eager to stake his claim to the Duchy of Brabant, and he rushed over to do just that. The siege of Compiegne continued for a few months after Philip's departure, and while the Anglo-Burgundian besieging force was slowly losing men to disease and desertion, things inside the city were not great, and their supplies were beginning to run out. However, things took a turn when a French army under the command of Poteau de Saint-Traille arrived in the area and was able to defeat the besieging army in a battle. This defeat did not lift the siege right away, but the defenders were able to resupply and destroy a number of Burgundian outposts as the besiegers attempted to regroup. At this point, the desertions rose from a trickle to a stream, and John of Luxembourg realized that he no longer was in a position to take Compiegne. And so, a few days later, the siege was lifted. Now it was the forces of Charles VII's turn to take the offensive, and an attack into Burgundian Picardy was soon launched. But that's a story for another episode, so let's go back to Joan of Arc at Beaurevoir. According to Joan herself at her subsequent trial, the three other Joans at Beaurevoir took good care of her, and took a shining to her. While John of Luxembourg was a staunch Anglophile, his aunt, wife, and stepdaughter seemed to have a more pro-Charles point of view. In fact, John's aunt, Joan of Luxembourg, was even Charles VII's godmother. Joan of Luxembourg became so fond of Joan of Arc that she even asked her nephew not to deliver the Maid to the English. And while all three Joans held some influence over John, Joan of Luxembourg likely held the most influence, because not only was she John of Luxembourg's aunt, she was also Philip of Saint-Pol's great-aunt, and consequently, when the Duke of Brabant died, she inherited his counties of Saint-Pol and Ligny. Joan of Luxembourg had no children, and while John was not the eldest of her nephews, he was her favorite, and so if he stayed in her good graces, he could expect to inherit the county of Ligny from her. John was being constantly pressured by the English to deliver Joan of Arc to them, but he also faced pressure closer to home to ransom her to the French. When Joan of Arc surrendered at Compiegne, she likely expected that she would be ransomed to the French, or exchanged for a high-profile English or Burgundian prisoner, as this is what would have happened to just about any other commander of Charles's army. But she was not just any commander, she was the Maid, and the English had an ideological reason to make sure that that did not occur. While Joan was at Beaurevoir, the English began preparations for Joan's trial for heresy. The man tapped to take charge of this trial was Pierre Cauchon, the Bishop of Beauvais. Cauchon began his career as a canon of the University of Paris, and became a key ally of John the Fearless in the university during the Duke of Burgundy's push for reform in the early 1400s. After the assassination of Louis of Orleans, Cauchon only became more fervently Burgundian, and he even took a leading role during the Cabochard revolt. Then, after the assassination of John the Fearless, Cauchon pushed for the Anglo-Burgundian alliance and helped to negotiate the Treaty of Troyes. Ever since, he had been one of the most Anglophile Burgundians. By 1430, he was in the service of Lancastrian France more than he was in the service of the Duke of Burgundy, and he was a member of Henry VI's French Royal Council. In addition to his loyal service to the English regime and his experience with church law, one other fact recommended him to lead the trial of Joan of Arc. The Maid was captured in the Diocese of Beauvais, and as Cauchon was the Bishop of Beauvais, he could reasonably claim jurisdiction. Upon her capture, Cauchon, on behalf of the Church and the Lancastrian regime, declared that Joan was accused of heresy and witchcraft, and thus should be denied the status of a prisoner of war, and instead she should be delivered to the Church so that she could be tried. But as we've seen, John of Luxembourg, despite his own support for the Lancastrian cause, was hesitant to just hand over his valuable prisoner. Cauchon visited Beauvais in July to try and convince Philip the Good and John of Luxembourg to hand over the Maid. While he did not succeed at this point, Joan was spooked enough by his visit to attempt another escape. The Maid leaped out of the tower she was being held in, and whether this was an attempt to secure her freedom or an attempted suicide, she survived but was too injured to make good her escape. She would be asked about the leap of Beauvais during her trial, as suicide was a mortal sin, and replied, quote, "I would prefer to surrender my soul to God than to be in the hands of the English." Joan of Arc's fate was sealed by two events: the failure of the siege of Compiegne and the death of Joan of Luxembourg. John of Luxembourg, now Count of Ligny, no longer had to worry about appeasing his aunt, and, likely bitter about the defeat at Compiegne, and in need of funds to carry on the war in Picardy, he finally agreed to ransom her to the English in November of 1430. Notably, in all the months which Joan was John of Luxembourg's prisoner, Charles VII made no attempt to ransom the Maid. Joan was moved from Beauvais to Arras to Le Crétois and finally to Rouen. While the University of Paris argued that the Maid's trial should be held in the French capital, Paris itself was still too exposed to the war, and so the Norman capital, the heart of the English occupation, was chosen instead. Joan's trial began in early 1431. Inquisitors were sent throughout France to gather evidence of Joan's life and deeds, and a few weeks later, the Inquisition of Joan of Arc began. Now, while the practices used in Joan's trial would not hold up under today's scrutiny, and even at the time they were questioned, Cauchon and the other judges were keen to at least make the process appear legitimate. Helen Castor writes, quote, "Scrupulous care was required in any inquisition into suspected heresy, but never more so than in this case, given that the accused had the temerity to suggest that God had sent her to wrest the kingdom from its rightful sovereign. That claim had been noised across Europe. The demonstration that it was false had therefore to be conducted and recorded with unimpeachable propriety and rigor, so that the judge's conclusions could be published equally widely. This trial was taken incredibly seriously by all involved, and it was certainly the trial of the century, maybe even the trial of the millennium. Interestingly, the care with which the trial was conducted has done a lot to immortalize Joan of Arc. Many of the details we have of her life come from the trial records, and we get a fairly good picture of her personality and intelligence from them. I won't be covering this trial in the detail that it might deserve, but I will encourage anyone interested in Joan of Arc to check out the trial transcripts, as they are available online for free in many languages, and are, in my opinion, some of the most fascinating primary sources from the Middle Ages. Even though the influence of Bedford and the other leaders of Lancastrian France was certainly felt at this trial, Joan's guilt was not necessarily a foregone conclusion, as can be seen in Bedford's demand that she be handed over to the English as a prisoner of war if she was found innocent. There were 131 judges, assessors, clerks, and other functionaries in charge of the trial, and only 8 of those were English prelates. The rest were all Frenchmen, with most coming from the University of Paris. Admittedly, these French judges were all Burgundian partisans, but Joan's trial was not an English affair. Now, the French nature of Joan's trial did not mean that her inquisition would be a friendly affair, though. She had faced examination at Poitiers when she first appeared in the public eye, but this trial would be far more hostile. Still, through it all, Joan of Arc remained defiant, witty, and self-assured. A comparison that is sometimes brought up is that of Saint Catherine of Alexandria. Catherine was a Roman Christian who faced persecution during the late 3rd century. According to hagiography, the Emperor Maximian summoned 50 pagan philosophers to debate her, and Catherine was able to best them all. Nevertheless, she was still condemned to death. Catherine of Alexandria was also one of the saints who Joan claimed carried messages to her from God. And while I'm sure that Joan took some solace in how the saint's ordeal echoed her own, I can't imagine that the Maid took much comfort from the end of Catherine's story. But at least at the beginning of the trial, Joan was confident in her acquittal. Sure, the Inquisition was made up of those who ideologically opposed her, but this was still a church trial, and Joan had confidence that God was still on her side, and that the church would see that. Unfortunately for Joan, that confidence was one of the things that the church was most anxious about. Joan did not defer to their leadership, and her assertion of an independent connection to God was a dangerous thing. Joan of Arc was not blind to that anxiety, but I do think she underestimated it, and she maintained her defiance, which did nothing to appease it. From the very start, the Maid refused to swear an oath to tell the truth, saying, quote, "I don't know what you want to question me about. Perhaps you might ask things that I will not tell you." And this attitude continued throughout her ordeal. Eventually, she was convinced to swear a more reserved oath, but when, on subsequent interrogations, she was asked to swear again, an attempt to get her to swear to the original oath, she refused, as she had already sworn once, and that should be good enough. In a common inquisitional tactic, she was asked many questions by several inquisitors all at once, in an attempt to trip her up. But Joan kept her cool and always replied that she would only answer their questions if they asked one at a time. Still, Joan often refused to answer many questions, especially those concerning her voices. When asked about them, she would often respond along the lines of, "If the voice forbade me to, what would you have me say about it?" Or, "I have a greater fear of failing my voices in saying something that displeases them than I have of answering you." When she did answer questions, she did so with an intelligence that surprised her interviewers. One of the most famous parts of the Inquisition came when she was asked whether she knew she was in the grace of God. This was a trick question, as church doctrine of the time declared that it was impossible to know if you were in God's grace. Therefore, if she answered yes, then that would be proof of her heresy, and if she answered no, then, well, she would have admitted to not being in God's grace. Joan sidestepped this dilemma by responding, "If I am not, may God put me there, and if I am, may God keep me there." The perfect response. As the trial wore on, and the long days of questioning began to wear Joan down, she began to answer more questions, but remained coy and refused to give many details. At one point, the inquisitors threatened Joan with torture, but she simply looked at the instruments laid out in front of her and replied, "If you were to have me torn limb from limb, and my soul separated from my body, I still won't tell you anything more. And if I did tell you anything else about this, afterwards I would always say that you had made me say it by force." In the end, torture, or at least physical torture, was never used. But that's not to say that there was no spiritual abuse. Joan of Arc was an incredibly pious woman, and often requested to be allowed to hear Mass, but this request was always refused. She was allowed a confessor, but that confessor was a plant, sent to try and pry damning evidence out of her. Throughout her inquisition, Joan gave her questioners little to work with, so in the end, two things were really seized on. The first of these was the fact that she wore men's clothing. Cross-dressing was considered a sin, and Joan was even questioned about it at Poitiers. There the theologians decided that the practical reasons for her wearing such clothes, such as to protect her from sexual assault, and to allow her to wear armor on the battlefield, outweighed the theological barrier. However, at Rouen, the Inquisition was more skeptical of those excuses and continually demanded that Joan change into women's clothing. The other thing which Joan's judges seized on was more abstract in nature. It had to do with medieval conceptions of the Church as made up of the Church triumphant, the Church in heaven, and the Church militant, the Church on earth. This conception was mostly discussed in academic circles and was rarely considered by lay people. Joan seemed to be under the impression that the Church militant was not the entire earthly church, but rather specifically was the Inquisition. So when asked what she would do if the Church militant decided that she was a heretic and that her visions were demonic, Joan replied that she would only submit to God. This gave the Inquisition all the ammo they needed to argue that Joan would not submit to the Church at all and was thus a heretic. Her unwillingness to submit to the Church militant, her cross-dressing, and a few other things which they managed to squeeze out of her, were gathered into an indictment. On May the 24th, 1431, Joan was led to a pyre, and the indictment was read out. She was then denounced for her heresy and heckled by a hostile crowd. Finally, she was given a letter of abjuration, which gave her one last out. One of her judges later stated, quote, "I remember well, in that letter it was noted that in the future she would neither carry arms, nor wear men's clothes, nor would she cut her hair short." In a surprising turn of events, Joan agreed to sign. This caught everybody off guard, and Pierre Cauchon was reported to have said to the man who handed Joan the letter, "You will have to pay for that." The crowd grew restless and hostile, but as this was a church affair, this abjuration would have to be taken seriously. In this situation, Joan was not an enemy of the state, but a repentant heretic. Joan was desperate and scared. The long trial had broken her spirit, and her health had declined. Shortly before the abortive execution, she had been struck by a serious illness. Faced with the fear of the fire, Joan of Arc abjured. The Maid was now a reformed heretic, and she would not be burnt. While the English certainly wanted her dead, her abjuration was still a win and would show that Charles VII's resurgence was not caused by divine approval. Joan of Arc may have expected to be freed eventually, and would one day be able to return home, but that was not the fate in store for her. She was still far too dangerous to be released, she was still denied the right to hear Mass and receive communion, and she would spend the rest of her life in an English prison. 3 days later, word reached Cauchon that Joan had resumed wearing men's clothing. When he came to investigate what was going on, Joan claimed that she was threatened with sexual assault, and at one point her dress was ripped off her, and only male clothes remained in her cell. But along with her male clothes came her spirit. She was no longer penitent, but defiant. The Maid declared that she did not understand the terms of her abjuration when she signed, and Joan argued that she had damned herself to save her life, and she could not live like that. While the Inquisition considered her a reformed heretic, she only felt heretical when she turned her back on her voices. They called on her to answer boldly when she was accused in front of the pyre, but the fear of the fire had made her give in. Now, as she truly understood her situation, she would rather die than endure any longer the suffering of her prison. And so she would die. A few days after Joan recanted, she was declared a lapsed heretic and led once more to the pyre. This time, she remained defiant as she was once again indicted, and her only request was to be given a cross. She took it, kissed it, and whispered a prayer as she was tied to the stake. As the pyre was set alight, her last words were, "Jesus, Jesus, Jesus." The words began to fade as the smoke rose, and before long, all you could hear were the crackles of the flame. Joan of Arc was no more. Thank you so much to my patrons: Christine, Duchesse de Nemours; Peter, Duc de Brancion; Elliot, Graaf von Gravenstein. Anthony, Comte de Chateauneuf-en-Auxois. Preston, Comte de Saint-Fargeau. Mark, Comte de Meursault. Diana, Graaf von Beersel. Mehmet, Comte Santerre. Chris, Comte de Seymour. David, Graaf von Bornum. Rosa, Comte de Tremoille. Elliot, Comte de Bussy-le-Grand. Quentin, Graaf von Blasfeld. Tyler, Comte de Chamaret. Ian, Graaf von Arenberg. Eric, Comte de Couche. David, Graaf von Barland. Jonathan, Comte de Bazoches. And to my Knights of the Duchy. If you want to join them, you can at patreon.com/ValoisBurgundy. If you want to support the podcast in other ways, you can do so by leaving a review on your podcast app of choice and telling your friends about the show. Both really help to grow the show and will earn you my everlasting appreciation. If you want to keep up with the show, you can follow me at Valois Burgundy on Twitter or Blue Sky, or find Grand Dukes of the West on Facebook. You can also email me at granddukesofthewest@gmail.com. And check out the podcast website for maps, images, sources, and more at granddukesofthewest.com. Once again, thank you for listening.